There is a particular kind of theft that leaves no fingerprints. It is conducted entirely within the law, it is celebrated rather than prosecuted. It is rewarded with chart positions and radio play and mainstream acceptance, and the specific kind of cultural legitimacy that the original creator was never going to be offered. Not because their version was inferior, but because their skin was the wrong color for the room where the decisions were being made. In 1956, Pat Boone recorded Tutti Frutti. He recorded it cleanly, carefully, with all the rough edges sanded down and all the dangerous energy removed and all the wild, gospel-drenched, physically total expressiveness that Little Richard had poured into the original, replaced with something that white radio programmers and white record store owners and white parents across America could receive without discomfort. The result was a version of the song that bore the same title and approximately the same melodic structure as Little Richard's original and shared almost nothing else with it. Not the spirit, not the urgency, not the specific quality of truth that had made the original so immediately, viscerally arresting. Pat Boone's version of Tutti Frutti outsold Little Richard's in several major markets. It reached higher chart positions in certain categories. It received more radio play on mainstream stations. It made Pat Boone, who had not written the song and had not originated it, and had brought nothing to it except his willingness to perform it at a lower temperature, significantly more money than it made the man who had created it. America cheered, and Little Richard watched. From a position that was both central and peripheral, the originator of something that was being celebrated in a form that had been deliberately stripped of everything that made the original matter, and understood something about the world he was operating and that he had perhaps suspected, but now knew with the clarity of personal experience. The story of what happened to Tutti Frutti in 1956 is not simply a story about one song or one act of musical appropriation. It is a story about the structure of the American music industry at a specific historical moment, a structure designed in ways both deliberate and atmospheric, to extract creative and cultural value from black artists and redistribute it into forms that white audiences could consume more comfortably and white artists could profit from more completely. And it is a story about what Little Richard did with that knowledge, how he carried it, how it shaped him, and how the awareness of what had been taken from him became part of the fuel that powered everything he built afterward. But to understand what was taken, you first have to understand what was created, because the theft only makes sense in proportion to the value of the original, and the original was extraordinary. Tutti Frutti was not a song that arrived fully formed from a comfortable creative distance. It was wrested out of lived experience, out of the specific, irreducible reality of being Richard Wayne Penniman in the American South in the mid-1950s, with all the complexity and conflict and hunger and joy and terror and gospel training and rhythm and blues absorption that identity contained. When Richard sat down at the piano in J.M.'s studio in New Orleans in September 1955 and produced that opening cry, that wordless ascending, purely human exclamation that preceded the first verse, he was not executing a calculated artistic strategy. He was releasing something that had been building in him for years, something that the formal structures of the recording session had been unable to capture until that moment, something that required the specific combination of circumstances that Bumps Blackwell had assembled in that room to finally find its exit point. The cry itself, A-wop, bop-loo, wop-bam-boom, was not language in the conventional sense. It was the place where language broke down under the pressure of what it was being asked to carry. It was what happened when the gospel training that had taught Richard to use his voice as a vessel for something larger than ordinary communication encountered the rhythm and blues framework that had given him a secular context for that vessel, and the collision produced a sound that the existing vocabulary of popular music did not yet have a name for. It was the sound of a person being completely themselves in a way that the world around them had consistently tried to prevent. It was the sound of suppressed energy finding its release point. It was, and this is the thing that the people who would later attempt to cover and sanitize it could not reproduce, because it cannot be reproduced by someone who does not carry the same specific history. It was the sound of someone who had been told, by every institutional voice that spoke to people like him, that who they were was insufficient, finding in a single moment of musical expression that the opposite was true. The recording captured this. The specific quality of Richard's vocal performance on the original, Tutti Frutti, the urgency, the physical totality, the sense of someone transmitting rather than performing, was not a production choice or a stylistic decision. It was simply what happened when you put a microphone in front of Richard Wayne Penniman at that specific moment in his life and let him be fully what he was. The record was released on Specialty Records in late 1955. It entered the rhythm and blues charts and climbed. It crossed over into the mainstream pop charts, an unusual achievement for a black artist on an independent label. a crossing that required a song of sufficient force to override the market mechanisms designed to keep rhythm and blues music contained within its designated commercial territory. Radio programmers who might have preferred to ignore it found themselves unable to, because their audiences were requesting it. The music had broken through, and that was when the machinery engaged. The machinery was not a conspiracy in the dramatic sense. It did not require a meeting of industry executives plotting to steal from black artists. It was something more ordinary and therefore more insidious, a set of established practices, market structures, and cultural assumptions that had been operating long before Tutti Frutti existed and that engaged automatically when a black artist's recording began reaching audiences that the industry considered primarily white territory. The practice was called covering. A white artist, typically one signed to a major label with access to mainstream radio and mainstream retail, would record a version of a song that had been a hit for a black artist on an independent label. The cover version would then be promoted through the channels that were not fully available to the original mainstream radio stations, mainstream record stores, mainstream press coverage. The cover would reach audiences that the original had not been permitted to reach, or had reached only partially, and in many markets the cover would outsell the original, not because it was better, but because it had access to distribution channels from which the original had been structurally excluded. This practice was legal. It operated within the licensing framework of the music industry, which required covers to pay mechanical royalties to the song's publisher but did not require any acknowledgement of or payment to the original recording artist beyond those mechanical royalties. The songwriter received something. The original recording artist received nothing from the cover's sales. The original label received nothing. The original performer received nothing beyond whatever their own record sales generated, sales that were often directly reduced by the cover's existence in the same market. Pat Boone was not the only white artist covering black music in this period. He was, in the mid-1950s, one of the most commercially successful practitioners of the form. He was young, conventionally handsome, with a pleasant and technically competent voice and a persona, wholesome, cut, explicitly Christian in his public presentation, that was maximally reassuring to the white mainstream audience that the major labels were primarily interested in serving. He covered Fats Domino. He covered El Dorados. He covered Little Richard. His version of Tutti Frutti was released in early 1956, a few months after Richard's original had established itself on the charts. Boone's production was clean and careful. The tempo slightly slowed, the vocal delivery smooth where Richard's had been raw, the overall texture of the record reassuring where the original had been alarming. The specific qualities that had made Richard's version so immediately arresting, the wildness, the physical urgency, the sense of something barely contained by the formal structure of the song, were absent from Boone's version. They had been removed deliberately, because they were precisely what made the original inaccessible to certain markets. What remained was the melody and the lyrical structure of a very good song, because Tutti Frutti was, underneath everything else, a very good song with a hook strong enough to survive significant dilution. Boone's version demonstrated the survival capacity by succeeding commercially even after the removal of the elements that had made the original extraordinary. In multiple markets, Pat Boone's Tutti Frutti outsold Little Richard's. On certain mainstream pop charts, Boone's version ranked higher. On mainstream radio, Boone's version received more play, not because programmers preferred it aesthetically, but because it was the version that their advertisers and their station owners and their assumptions about their audiences made it easier to play. Little Richard watched this happen. He watched it with the full awareness of someone who understood exactly what was occurring and why, who had no institutional recourse against it, and who had to decide what to do with that understanding. What he did with it was complicated and human and not reducible to a single response. There was anger. There was the specific, grinding frustration of watching something you created be taken and transformed into something safer and more profitable for someone else. There was the particular pain of the public dimension, of watching Pat Boone perform Tutti Frutti on television programs that Richard had not been invited to appear on, to audiences that had not been considered primarily his. But there was also something else. Something that the anger and the frustration existed alongside rather than replacing. Little Richard had been performing long enough, and had watched the music industry operate long enough, to understand that what was happening to him was not personal in the narrow sense. It was systematic. Pat Boone was not his enemy. Pat Boone was a symptom, a working musician operating within a system that offered him advantages he had not designed and that he was not required by law or convention to refuse. The system was the problem. The system was what had been built deliberately and over time to ensure that the creative and financial rewards of black musical innovation flowed predominantly toward white performers and white-owned institutions. Understanding this did not make the specific experience of watching Pat Boone's Tutti Frutti climb the charts any less painful. But it gave the pain a context that was larger than a single song or a single competitor. And context, for someone with Richard's intelligence and historical awareness, was not a comfort exactly, but it was a form of clarity. He knew what he was dealing with, he knew the dimensions of the problem. He could not solve it unilaterally, but he could respond to it in ways that maintained his integrity and, where possible, his commercial position. What he did, practically, was perform. He performed with an intensity and a completeness that no cover version could replicate, because the cover's entire commercial strategy depended on replicating the song while removing the qualities that made the original irreplaceable. And those qualities were not the song, they were the performer. They lived in the specific body and voice and history and spirit of Richard Wayne Penniman, and they could not be transferred to Pat Boone or anyone else regardless of how carefully the melody and lyrics were reproduced. This was in a fundamental sense his defense. Not a legal defense, the law offered him very little. Not a financial defense, the covering system had been specifically designed to limit his financial recourse. But an artistic defense, the demonstration repeated in every live performance and every recording he made, that the original contained something the cover did not and could not contain, that the thing that made Tutti Frutti matter was not available for transfer. He was right, and history, which often moves slowly in these matters, eventually confirmed it. The cover versions that dominated certain markets in 1956 are today footnotes, curiosities, period documents, evidence of a system rather than evidence of musical value. Little Richard's original is the record that persisted. The opening cry that Pat Boone's version had removed is the sound that changed music. The quality of presence and urgency and total self-expression that the cover had sanded away is what every subsequent generation of musicians and listeners returned to when they returned to Tutti Frutti. But this retrospective justice, which is real and matters and should be acknowledged, did not undo the specific injury of 1956. It did not return the chart positions or the radio play or the mainstream exposure or the money. It did not change what had happened or what it had demonstrated about how the industry operated. It simply confirmed in the long run what had been true from the beginning, that the original was the thing and the cover was the shadow. The Pat Boone episode was not isolated. It was one instance of a pattern that repeated itself throughout the early years of rock and roll, a pattern so consistent that it constituted a feature rather than a bug of the industry's operation. Fats Domino saw his songs covered, Chuck Berry saw his songs covered, Bo Diddley saw his songs covered. The rhythm and blues artists who had developed the musical language that was coalescing into rock and roll watched as white artists recorded versions of their innovations and accessed markets and audiences that remained partially or fully closed to the originators. Little Richard experienced this pattern with particular acuity because his style was so immediately, viscerally distinctive that the cover versions were especially audible in their inadequacy, especially clear in their failure to capture what made the original matter. When Pat Boone sang Tutti Frutti, the distance between the cover and the original was so large that it functioned almost as an inadvertent tribute to the original's irreducibility. You could hear, in the gap between the two versions, exactly what Richard had done that nobody else could do. He spoke about it. Not always publicly, not always in the measured tones of someone carefully managing their public image, but he spoke about it. He named what had happened. He refused the industry's preferred framing, which was that covering was simply a normal part of how popular music worked, a neutral practice with no racial dimension, and insisted on the accurate framing that the covering of black artists by white artists was a mechanism of redistribution, a way of taking creative value from the people who had produced it and placing it in contexts where different people could profit from it more fully. This insistence was not comfortable for the industry to hear. It is not comfortable now, which is one reason why the story of what happened to Tutti Frutti in 1956 tends to get compressed rather than examined. The compression is convenient. It allows the celebration of rock and roll's origins without a full accounting of the conditions under which those origins were exploited. It permits a narrative of musical progress that does not require a corresponding narrative of structural injustice. Little Richard did not permit the compression. He kept talking about it, in interview after interview, decade after decade, with a persistence that some found tiresome, and that was, in fact, the minimum required response to a wrong that had never been fully righted. He was not seeking sympathy. He was seeking accuracy. He was insisting that the record, not just the musical record but the historical record, reflect what had actually happened. The longer story of Little Richard's relationship with the covering system contains a dimension that is sometimes overlooked: the degree to which the injustice he experienced, and named, and refused to pretend had not occurred, contributed to the gradual dismantling of the most egregious aspects of the practice. The late 1950s and 1960s saw significant changes in how mainstream radio and mainstream retail engaged with black artists and black-owned labels. Changes that were driven not by the industry's sudden enlightenment, but by a combination of factors that included the increasing impossibility of ignoring the commercial power of the original reportings. Little Richard's records were simply too good, too alive, too immediate, too much themselves, to be permanently displaced by their covers in any market where listeners had access to both. As distribution improved and as radio formats evolved, and as the cultural authority of rhythm and blues expanded beyond the market segments it had been assigned to, the originals began to reclaim territory that the covers had occupied. The songs found their way back to their sources, but the money that had been extracted during the years when the covers dominated, that did not come back. The chart positions did not retroactively correct themselves. The radio play that had gone to Pat Boone instead of Little Richard did not get replayed. The injury was permanent in its financial and commercial dimensions, even as it was eventually corrected in the cultural and historical ones. This is the full accounting that Little Richard insisted on. Not just the celebration of his music's survival and influence, though that survival and influence were real and extraordinary, but the acknowledgement of the specific cost that had been extracted from him and from the artists who shared his situation. The music had won in the end. The musicians had paid a price that the winning did not entirely repay. He carried this knowledge with the particular combination of pride and grievance that characterized his public persona on this subject. A combination that was not contradiction but accuracy. He was proud of what he had created. He was aggrieved by how it had been treated. Both things were true simultaneously, and he refused to let either one erase the other. When he stood on stages in later decades and received Lifetime Achievement Awards and Rock and Roll Hall of Fame recognition, and the other forms of belated institutional acknowledgement that the music industry offers its pioneers once their pioneering is safely historical, he received these honors with the awareness of everything they could not give back and everything they were attempting, however imperfectly, to acknowledge. The acknowledgement was real. The incompleteness was also real. He said so. Always he said so. Because the full truth required saying both things, the celebration and the accounting, and Little Richard had never been a person who told partial truths when the full truth was available. Pat Boone's Tutti Frutti is today a historical document. Little Richard's Tutti Frutti is today a living thing, still played, still felt, still capable of producing in a listener who encounters it for the first time the specific, unmediated, full-body response that it produced in 1955 when a young man from Macon opened his mouth in a New Orleans studio and released everything he had been carrying. The cover is the shadow. The original is the light. The shadow does not diminish the light, but the shadow's existence and the conditions that produced it, and the specific injury those conditions inflicted on the person who made the light, these things deserve to be named and understood and remembered alongside the celebration. Little Richard named them. He understood them, he remembered them, and now so do you. End of story. Script.